The day my neighbor's fence blew down in a storm, I got my first real look at the chaos in his backyard. Mountains of scrap metal, old machinery, and what I assumed was just decades of hoarding. I was about to call the city to complain when I noticed something glinting in the sunlight. That glint changed everything. What I discovered in that messy pile of junk didn't just make me a millionaire, it taught me that sometimes the most valuable things in life are hiding in plain sight, looking like absolute garbage. My name is Jake, and 2 years ago I thought I'd found the perfect house. It was everything I dreamed of. A beautiful 1920s craftsman home in a quiet neighborhood. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, and a kitchen that belonged in a magazine. The price was right, the location was perfect, and I could already picture myself hosting barbecues in the spacious backyard. There was just one problem. My next-door neighbor's property looked like a natural disaster had hit it. When the realtor showed me the house, she conveniently timed our visit so we couldn't see over the 6-foot privacy fence that separated my future backyard from whatever hellscape existed next door. But I could hear it, the sound of metal clanging, engines running at odd hours, and what sounded like heavy machinery being moved around. "What's the deal with the neighbor?" I asked her. "Oh, that's just old Pete," she said with a wave of her hand. "He's harmless, been there for 30 years, keeps to himself." That should have been my first red flag. When someone says a neighbor keeps to himself, it usually means they're either running a meth lab or collecting something they shouldn't be collecting. But I was in love with the house, and the price was too good to pass up. How bad could one neighbor really be? I found out on my first morning in my new home. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of what I can only describe as a metal tornado. Crashes, bangs, the screech of machinery, and occasionally what sounded like an old truck engine being tortured to death. I stumbled outside with my coffee to investigate, and that's when I got my first glimpse of my neighbor's backyard through a gap in our shared fence. It was worse than I'd imagined. Mountains of scrap metal dominated the space. Rusted car parts, old appliances, twisted pieces of machinery I couldn't even identify. Weeds grew through everything, creating this apocalyptic landscape that looked like nature was slowly reclaiming a junkyard. And in the middle of it all was Pete. Pete looked exactly like you'd expect someone who lived in a scrap metal maze to look. 60-something, weathered face, clothes that had seen better decades, and hands that were permanently stained with grease and dirt. He was dragging what looked like an old transmission across his yard, completely oblivious to the fact that it was barely dawn and his neighbors might be sleeping. "Morning," I called out, trying to be friendly. Pete looked up, squinted at me like I was an alien, grunted something that might have been a greeting, and went back to his work. That was the extent of our first conversation. Over the next few weeks, I tried to be understanding. Maybe Pete was a mechanic who worked from home. Maybe he was restoring classic cars. Maybe there was a method to his madness that I just couldn't see. But as the months went by, it became clear that Pete wasn't restoring anything. He was collecting. Every few days, a truck would pull up and dump more metal onto his property. Old washing machines, car engines, pieces of industrial equipment that looked like they belonged in a museum. My beautiful backyard, which I'd planned to turn into an entertaining space, became unusable. The smell, a combination of rust, oil, and decay, drifted over our fence. The noise started at sunrise and continued until sunset, and the sight of that metal mountain looming over our property line made me question every decision I'd made about buying this house. By year 2, I'd had enough. My property value was definitely affected. I could see potential buyers driving by, looking at my house with interest until they noticed Pete's collection next door. Then they'd speed up and drive away. I'd complained to the city, but apparently Pete had all the right permits for whatever he was doing. I'd contacted the homeowners association, but our neighborhood didn't have one. I'd even looked into moving, but the housing market had shifted and I'd lose money on the sale. I was trapped next to what looked like the world's most depressing metal sculpture garden. That's when I started getting creative with my complaints. I called the fire department about potential hazards. They came out, took a look, and said everything was fine. I called the Environmental Protection Agency about possible contamination. They tested the soil and found nothing dangerous. I even called animal control, claiming I'd seen rats. But they said a little metal storage never hurt anyone. Pete, meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered by my campaign against his lifestyle. He'd wave at me cheerfully while dragging another piece of rusted machinery across his yard, as if we were the best of friends and not engaged in the world's most passive-aggressive property dispute. I was running out of options and patience then. Mother Nature intervened. The storm hit on a Tuesday night in March. Not just any storm, one of those Texas thunderstorms that makes you question whether someone upstairs is personally angry with your zip code. Wind gusts hit 60 miles per hour. The rain came down in sheets, and the lightning was so constant it looked like a strobe light had been installed in the sky. I spent most of the night lying awake, listening to things crash and bang outside, praying that none of Pete's metal collection would become airborne and land in my living room when I woke up the next morning. My first thought was to check for damage. That's when I saw it. Our shared fence had been completely destroyed. Not just damn 6 feet of privacy fence that had mercifully hidden Pete's collection from my direct view was now scattered across both our yards in pieces. For the first time in 2 years, I had an unobstructed view of my neighbor's backyard, and what I saw took my breath away. Standing in my kitchen, looking out through the sliding glass door, I could see Pete's entire operation laid out before me. It was even worse than I'd imagined. The metal collection stretched from one property line to the other, organized in towering piles that defied both physics and common sense. Rusted car frames were stacked like metallic pancakes. Old appliances formed small mountain ranges. Pieces of industrial machinery created a maze that only Pete could navigate. I was reaching for my phone to call my insurance company. Surely, this fence situation fell under act of God coverage when something caught my eye. A glint, just a small flash of light reflecting off something in Pete's collection. But it wasn't the dull, rusty reflection you'd expect from old scrap metal. This was different. Brighter, cleaner. I grabbed my binoculars. Yes, I owned binoculars specifically for spying on Pete's activities. Don't judge me, and focused on the spot where I'd seen the glint. What I saw made me lower the binoculars and look again with my naked eyes. Convinced I was hallucinating. Sitting in the middle of Pete's junkyard, partially hidden under a tarp but exposed by the storm, was what looked like a pristine vintage motorcycle. Not just any vintage motorcycle. Even from my limited vantage point, I could see the distinctive shape, the chrome that somehow remained unrusted despite being surrounded by corrosion, and what looked like original paint that gleamed in the morning sunlight. I raised the binoculars again and looked closer. That's when I saw the second one, and the third, and the fourth. Pete wasn't just collecting scrap metal, hidden under tarps, buried behind piles of rusty junk, camouflaged by decades of carefully arranged chaos, was what looked like a collection of vintage vehicles that belonged in a museum. Asterisk. I spent the rest of that day glued to my window like a detective conducting surveillance. Every time Pete moved a piece of scrap metal or adjusted a top, I caught glimpses of more treasures hidden in his collection. What I had assumed was a hoarder's paradise was actually the most brilliant camouflage job I'd ever seen. There were motorcycles, dozens of them. Cars that looked like they belonged in classic car shows. Pieces of machinery that weren't just old, they were antique. And everything hidden so well that you'd have to know what you were looking for to see it. Pete wasn't a hoarder, he was a collector. But why hide it? Why make his property look like a disaster zone when he was sitting on what was obviously a fortune in vintage vehicles and equipment? That evening, as Pete was securing tarps over his newly exposed collection, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I walked over to the gap where our fence used to be. "Hey Pete," I called out. He looked up from tying down a tarp, squinted at me in that way that had become familiar, and waited. "Hell of a storm, huh?" "Yep," he said, his first complete word to me in 2 years. "I couldn't help but notice you've got some interesting stuff over here." Pete straightened up slowly, and for the first time since I'd known him, he really looked at me. Not the dismissive glance he usually gave me, but an actual assessment. "Most folks just see junk," he said. "I'm not most folks." That was apparently the right answer, because Pete cracked what might have been a smile. "You want to see something really interesting?" he asked. Asterisk. What happened next was like being given a private tour of the world's most unlikely treasure trove. Pete led me through his collection, and with every step, my understanding of what I was looking at changed completely. "This here's a 1947 Indian Chief," he said, pulling back a tarp to reveal a motorcycle that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. One of maybe 50 left in the world in this condition. He moved to the next tarp. 1969 Dodge Charger, RT, numbers matching. Original paint, bought it for $500 in 1987 when everyone thought muscle cars were finished. Another tarp. 1952 Ferguson tractor, last one I've seen with the original hydraulic system intact. For 45 minutes, Pete showed me a collection that represented decades of careful acquisition, meticulous restoration, and what was obviously an encyclopedic knowledge of automotive and mechanical history. Every piece looked like junk from the outside, but underneath the carefully applied patina of rust and neglect, Pete had been preserving automotive history. "Why hide it all?" I finally asked. Pete looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. "You think I want every thief and treasure hunter in Texas knowing what I've got back here? You think I want the government coming around asking questions about property taxes based on the real value of this stuff?" That's when it hit me. "Pete," I said slowly, "do you have any idea what this collection is worth?" He shrugged. "I know what I paid for it. Most of it I got for scrap prices back when nobody wanted old American metal." "No, I mean what it's worth now today, on the current market." Pete looked around at his collection like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes for the first time. "I don't pay much attention to that stuff. I collect because I love it, not because I want to sell it." That's when I realized Pete was sitting on a fortune and had absolutely no idea. Asterisk. I spent the next 3 days researching. Every evening after work, I came home and dove into classic car websites, vintage motorcycle forums, and auction results. I looked up every make and model I could remember from Pete's collection. What I found made my hands shake. The 1947 Indian Chief Pete had shown me. Recent auction results showed similar models selling for $80,000 to $120,000. The 1969 Charger RT, depending on the options and condition, anywhere from $150,000 to $300,000. The Ferguson tractor that looked like a rusty piece of farm equipment. Vintage farm machinery collectors were paying $25,000 to $50,000 for restored examples, and that was just the beginning. I counted at least 30 vehicles in various stages of restoration hidden throughout Pete's property. If my rough calculations were even close to accurate, my neighbor was sitting on a collection worth somewhere between $3 million and $5 million. On Friday evening, I printed out everything I'd found and walked over to Pete's house. He answered the door in his usual work clothes, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. That had probably started life as a white t-shirt sometime in the Clinton administration. "I've got something to show you," I said, holding up the stack of papers. Pete looked suspicious. "If this is about the fence, I already called a guy. It's not about the fence, it's about your collection." His expression shifted from suspicious to interested. "What about it? Can I come in?" Pete's house was like his backyard, organized chaos. That made perfect sense once you understood the system. Every available surface was covered with automotive magazines, parts catalogs, and restoration manuals. The walls were lined with shelves, holding carefully labeled jars of screws, bolts, and small parts. It was the home of someone who understood that the difference between junk and treasure was often just knowledge and attention to detail. I spread my research across his kitchen table. "Pete, I want to show you what your collection is worth on today's market for the next hour." I walked him through auction results, current market values, and trend analyses. I showed him pictures of vehicles identical to his selling for prices that made his coffee cup stop halfway to his mouth. "This can't be right," he said, staring at a listing for a 1969 Charger RT that had sold for $275,000. "It's not just right, it's conservative. The collector car market has exploded in the last 10 years. What you bought for scrap prices in the 80s and 90s, people are now paying six figures for." Pete was quiet for a long time, looking through the papers, occasionally shaking his head. Finally, he looked up at me. "Why are you showing me this?" It was a fair question. 2 years of me complaining about his property, and now I was here telling him he was rich. What was my angle? "Because," I said, "I think we can help each other." "How's that?" "You've got a collection worth millions that's being hidden under tarps and deteriorating in the weather. I've got a background in business and marketing. What if we found a way to properly showcase and sell some of this collection?" Pete raised an eyebrow. "You want to be my business partner. I want to be your friend. The business partnership would just be a bonus." What happened over the next 6 months changed both our lives. Pete, it turned out, wasn't just a collector, he was a restoration genius. He could take a rusted Hulk and turn it into a show-quality vehicle using nothing but hand tools, determination, and 40 years of accumulated knowledge have brought the business skills, market research, networking, photography, and sales strategy. Our first project was the 1947 Indian Chief. Pete spent 3 weeks bringing it from hidden treasure to museum quality. I handled the documentation, authentication, and marketing. We sold it at auction for $118,000. Pete stared at the check for so long I thought he might be having a stroke. "That's more money than I made in 3 years at the factory," he said. "Pete," I told him, "that's just the beginning." Over the next 5 months, we restored and sold 6 more vehicles. A 1965 Mustang Fastback that went for $85,000. A 1970 Plymouth Cuda that brought $195,000. A 1959 Cadillac Eldorado that a collector in California paid $140,000 to have shipped cross-country. My share of the profits, we split everything. 50/50 after expenses was just over $300,000. But Pete's transformation was worth more than the money. The grumpy recluse who had barely acknowledged my existence for 2 years became one of the most knowledgeable and passionate people I'd ever met. When he talked about the history of a particular vehicle, the engineering innovations, the cultural significance, his eyes lit up like a professor discussing his favorite subject. We were making money, but more importantly, we were preserving automotive history and giving Pete's decades of careful collecting the recognition it deserved. By month 8, word was getting around the collector car community about Pete's collection. Buyers started coming to us instead of us going to auction. Private collectors, museum curators, and restoration shops began making pilgrimages to what was no longer a junkyard, but had become known as Pete's Place. We set up a proper showroom in Pete's garage. We created a website showcasing the collection. We started attending classic car shows, not as vendors, but as exhibitors, sharing the stories behind these rescued vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 2 years, I'd been trying to get Pete to clean up his act. Now his messy backyard was featured in classic car magazines as an example of hidden gems in plain sight. But the real change was in our relationship. Pete became the mentor I never knew I needed. He taught me about engines, restoration techniques, and the patience required to bring something back from the edge of destruction. I taught him about marketing, customer relations, and the business side of his passion. We rebuilt that fence between our properties, but now it had a gate. Pete would come over for dinner and I'd help him with weekend projects. The man I'd once considered my nemesis became my business partner, my teacher, and my friend. 18 months after that storm brought down our fence, we made our biggest sale yet. The buyer was a collector from Japan who specialized in American muscle cars from the 1960s. He'd heard about Pete's collection through the network of enthusiasts who had visited us, and he made the trip to Texas specifically to see what we had available. Pete showed him around the collection, and the buyer was politely interested in several pieces. But then Pete pulled back a tarp in the far corner of his property, revealing something he'd been saving for last. "This one's not for sale," Pete said, "but you might appreciate seeing it." It was a 1970 Plymouth Hemi-Cuda convertible. I'd seen it before, but only partially and never in direct sunlight. Now, seeing it properly for the first time, I understood why Pete had been saving it. It wasn't just rare, it was historically significant. One of only 14 ever made with that specific combination of engine, transmission, and options. The kind of vehicle that museums fight over and collectors dream about finding. The buyer from Japan took one look at it and went very quiet. "This car," he said carefully, "is not supposed to exist." Pete looked confused. "What do you mean?" "According to Plymouth's records, all 14 of these cars have been accounted for. 13 are in known collections, and one was destroyed in a fire in 1987. "Well," Pete said, "I guess their records are wrong." The buyers spent the next 2 hours examining every detail of the car, taking photographs and making phone calls. 2 experts back in Japan. Finally, he approached us with an offer that made my legs weak. "I will pay $2 million for this vehicle," he said. "Cash, immediate transfer, no conditions." Pete was quiet for so long I thought he might refuse the offer. "That's a lot of money," he finally said. "It's a lot of car," the buyer replied. Pete looked at me. "What do you think, partner?" I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, a storm that knocked down a fence, a neighbor I'd considered a nuisance who turned out to be sitting on automotive history, a friendship built over shared passion and mutual respect. "I think," I said, "it's your call, but that car could fund a lot more restoration projects." Pete nodded slowly, then looked at the buyer. "Deal. That was 6 months ago. My share of the Hemi-Cuda sale was $1 million after taxes and expenses." Pete used his share to expand the operation, buying a proper workshop and hiring 2 apprentices to help with restorations. We're not just restoring cars anymore, we're teaching young people the skills Pete has spent 40 years developing. The messy backyard that once drove me crazy is now home to a legitimate business that employs 6 people and has a waiting list of customers from around the world. The house that I bought 2 years ago, the one I was convinced would lose value because of my neighbor's junkyard, it's now worth 40% more than I paid for it, thanks to being adjacent to one of the most respected vintage vehicle restoration facilities in the state. But the money, as significant as it is, isn't the real treasure I found in Pete's backyard. The real treasure was learning that my assumptions about people, about value, and about what constitutes ugly were completely wrong. Pete taught me that sometimes the most valuable things in life don't look valuable from the outside. Sometimes preservation requires camouflage. Sometimes the neighbor you think is ruining your property value is actually sitting on more wealth than you could imagine. And sometimes the best business partnerships start with the worst neighbor disputes. I still live in the same house. Pete still lives next door. But now, instead of complaining about the noise, I join him in the workshop on weekends. And every time I look out my kitchen window at the place where our fence used to be, I'm reminded that the difference between junk and treasure is often just a matter of perspective. The storm that knocked down our fence didn't just give me a view of Pete's collection. It gave me a new way of seeing the world. Sometimes the most beautiful things are hidden behind the ugliest facades. Sometimes the most successful partnerships begin with the greatest conflicts. And sometimes, the answer to your problems is literally sitting in your neighbor's backyard, waiting for the right storm to reveal it. Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearances? Have you discovered hidden value in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to look beyond the surface.